Hello, this is Robin Howe, and I am here today with my good friend, Dr. Michael Dorer. Michael and I have been, we've known each other for a very long time, and Michael was actually my instructor when I got my elementary training many years ago, and now we've been colleagues in many different institutions and presented together, so I'm really pleased to have him here with me today to talk about one of his passions and one of the things that I think he uniquely brings an area of expertise and passion to the world of Montessori, which is the topic of storytelling in Montessori. So Dr. Dora is a longtime Montessorian, and I'm sure I'm not going to get everything that he has, but he did his early childhood training and then went to Bergamo, Italy, where he got his elementary training. And then I believe you actually got a second elementary training. So obviously a very experienced Montessori educator and has been the director of many different training programs. But more recently, he's been, I'll say you, Michael, more recently you've been doing a lot of work with storytelling. Mm-hmm. And in the last, I'll call it 5 years, wrote and published The Deep Well of Time, which I know that many, many Montessorians are now using, and has some very dear stories that I got that were shared with me during my training. And then more recently, you wrote the book Hatching the Cosmic Egg, which is again something I think will be a staple in Montessori classrooms for years to come. And so you represent in my opinion, a area of Montessori that I think is really underappreciated, which again is storytelling. So thank you so much for being here and being willing to talk about it. So the first thing I'd like to just ask you to do is just talk about historically or philosophically, why is storytelling important in Montessori collectively?
First of all, let me say thank you for having me here. I really appreciate it. And the kind remarks you just made, I appreciate that too. You know, some people talk about Montessori and contrast it with traditional education. But the most traditional education, the single most traditional education in humanity is storytelling. Long before there was writing, long before there was reading, people told stories. And so if we're using storytelling in Montessori, we are the traditional education. And I think that's where we want to be, because the idea that humanity evolved, I don't know when, somewhere 500,000 years ago or so, but writing only emerged about 6,000 years ago, means we've had many, many, many more times to use storytelling than writing. And therefore, it's like it's hardwired in us. It's something that's in us. It's so much in us that when you're dealing with young children, and I know we want to talk about third plane, but when you're dealing with young children, they need to learn how to read, but they don't need to learn how to hear a story. It's there, it's built into us. And you know what? It doesn't go away. It doesn't go away when you're 5 or 8 or 10 or 15, for that matter, into the secondary, or as adults. I think for us in Montessori, to access that part of us, which is nature-made, which is naturally in us, is an important thing. That we realize that if we're going to follow humanity, follow childhood, follow each child, we need to look at the inner proclivities of what's inside of us and build our education around that. One of those things is storytelling and story listening too.
Great. Yeah, and obviously I asked the question about just the role of storytelling in Montessori, and I think that's, one of the really wonderful things about Montessori. And then, even looking at things like the Great Lessons, which are meant to be impressionistic stories to inspire the elementary age kid. But then we get to the third plane, and then, we don't hear about it much, right? And so,
you're correct there, and I think I'm disappointed in a lot of the secondary Montessori programs. I hate to say that. I'm impressed by many, but sometimes I'm disappointed because they often seem to be quite starkly didactic, very teacherish is a word that I heard somebody use. Um, I think that you brought up a really good example with the great lessons. The great lessons are the universe, life, humanity, language, and mathematics. Those don't go away when you're 13. They don't go away when you're 33, for that matter. Life is still there. The universe is still there. All five of those components, if you look at lessons we teach young people in the secondary, or for that matter in college, nearly, I'd say everything that we teach could be related back to one or more of those particular topics. Therefore, I think as a holistic educator, it's incumbent upon us to continue to do that at all levels, and not stop when they're 12. So how can we do that? Well, of course, those stories can't be the same as what we're giving them to a 6-year-old, because those children who are now 13 have much broader scientific knowledge, for example, much broader linguistic knowledge. But we can still tell about those things. We can still tell a great story. And I think we should. And then we should tell other stories too. Because one of the things that teenagers need very strongly is to be able to express themselves. And we know that according to Bloom's taxonomy, creativity is the highest level of thinking. So expressing oneself creatively in writing, in drama, in acting, in music, for example, in singing, in opera or whatever, all of those start with a storyline somewhere. That's the genesis of all that kind of thing. And therefore, we can't drop it and still think we're authentic.
Yeah, and we just, you and I have spoke at some length about over the course of the years about curriculum, and when I'm thinking about the secondary student, I often think about, even myself, I think about these high stakes. We want to make sure as our children are getting older that they achieve academic benchmarks, and we want to, in many Montessori schools, we feel the pressure building because parents and children are starting to think about college. And then I think about things like storytelling, which is not necessarily a hard skill, but I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. And I think then again, storytelling has this idea of reading a book, but remember that these adolescents and these young men and women are so socially engaged that even though we don't use it academically, they're really pumping in all cylinders in storytelling themselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things I think we could start with when we're talking with teenagers is everybody has a story. Everybody has a lot of stories. They have stories themselves, stories of their own life. Some of those stories may seem mundane. They may seem sort of, well, it's hardly worth telling, but that's not true. The truth is everybody's story is worth telling. And we can help encourage that by telling our personal stories to the children. Well, they're not children anymore, to the young people, and encourage them to tell a story about some sort of outstanding incident that they can remember for some reason. I often start with, think of a time that you had to have a Band-Aid. You had to have a Band-Aid put on, because every single person that I've ever had in school has gotten hurt at some point. So therefore, we can all talk about something like that. The key is to be able to actually speak before others. And so you have to start with something that's easy, that allows you to focus on that, because otherwise we graduate with people who are afraid to be public speakers, who are afraid to speak in front of a group, who have that ability but have never really cultivated it. They've allowed that not to happen. So I think that stories can absolutely enhance any subject that we're dealing with. I know you've heard of a phenomenon that we have in America, and probably it's worldwide now, called TED Talks. And that's very popular, and I enjoy some of those. Interestingly enough, they keep a record of how many hits each different talk gets. The top 10 TED Talks all started with somebody telling a story.
I didn't know that.
That means it reached people. And those people who are watching the TED Talks are not elementary school kids. Well, maybe some of them are, but many of them are adults. So stories are reaching people of adult age too. They don't go away. They're always there.
Well, I mean, you brought up something interested in using that example. And so again, we talk about Montessori that we, at the beginning at the elementary levels, we start our years with these great lessons. Then we get to secondary, and then we don't have stories necessarily. As we mentioned, they sort of go away. And then we think about things like, well, we don't tell stories, but then we look at things like movie industries and the success of video series and series. And so I'm just thinking out loud, there's this sort of disconnect of this idea that we stop, and the reality is they become more and more complex and important. So I guess, part of my goal in having you here was to try to figure out what is some advice we could give to secondary teachers or administrators of secondary programs that might allow them to feel more comfortable with actually allowing this idea of stories in their classroom. Is there anything else you can think that you want to share as an expert Montessori storyteller?
Well, when I've told stories to secondary kids, the kids 13, 14, 15 and above, and I talk to the administrators and the teachers there, I try to draw a relationship between stories and writing, stories and creativity, that a lot of the skills we think about in reading and writing, like comprehension. And by the way, we have a crisis nationally in reading comprehension, that there are many young people who can read words but can't tell you about what they read. Mm-hmm. They can read the words, but they can't tell you about it. Well, that begins with oral comprehension. So there's this exact same skill in a friendlier, I'd say, climate, the oral climate. The same thing with writing a story, writing a play, or you mentioned Hollywood, you're doing a film. It has to start with a story. So I like to talk to them about, let's do the story, and then let's translate that into, what would you like? Drama, a written essay, or a play, or even poetry. So at the genesis of all of this is story, and it leads to these creative things. But it does another thing, and I tell this to the administrators too, since you're asking. People understand things in different ways. All of us do. But we have to recognize in a classroom, if we've got 25 children, 25 adults, 25 college students, or 25 teenagers, if we've probably got at least 12 different ways of understanding things. So not everybody's going to understand chemistry in the way that maybe we traditionally teach it. Not everybody's going to understand calculus in the way we traditionally teach it, or for that matter, not everyone's going to understand history, or even decoding of sounds and phonics and so on. But if we teach it in another way, in a story way, we offer an alternate channel for people to be able to understand something. And that supplementary channel leads to being able to direct them back to the subject matter at hand. It's not a waste of time, which I think is what's barring a lot of secondary people, that they think it's just fluff. It's just icing on the cake. But if properly approached, storytelling is the cake. It's not the icing.
Love it. Well, again, I've heard some great new metaphors today, so thank you for that. Michael, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for sharing that insight into storytelling at the secondary level and just storytelling period. And as I've mentioned before, and I think you've experienced it before, I've had the luxury of being with some of the same students that I taught as lower elementary students, and now that I've graduated, graduated high school and are in college, or some that have even finished college. And one of the things that they always remember are some of the great stories that I told that were shared with me during my training that are now in your book. So I want to thank you again for that. And just, as you know, I really value storytelling and appreciate you sharing that. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciated being here and, of course, talking about my passion, one of them, which is storytelling. So thanks, Robin. I really appreciate it.
Great.